Group Session 16, Healing Shame. Charlie, I'm a bad person. Therapist, what makes you say that? Long reflective pause. Charlie, I don't know. I just feel that way. You may be looking forward to this chapter, but it's possible you're not. Certain people who experienced childhood harm can feel uncomfortable even thinking about the role of shame in their lives. It can seem like quite a dark, unpleasant, or complicated subject. If you don't have very positive feelings about this subject, we'd encourage you to take your time and stay with it for a couple of reasons. First, shame is a subject which deserves its own chapter. It's that important. Second, shame probably is a dark, unpleasant, and complicated subject, but getting to grips with this feeling is usually an important and necessary step for recovery. While the first part of this chapter focuses on understanding how shame may operate in your life, the second part will actively support you in taking some steps in healing shame. What is shame? Shame is a negative emotion which occurs in relation to my sense of self. Shame is the felt sense of badness, defectiveness, or not okayness. However, to really understand this emotion for our purposes, we need to make a distinction between normal shame and trauma based shame. And it's useful to look at the difference between shame and guilt. If this all feels complicated, please stay with it. Understanding and dealing with this complex emotion can be a powerful tool for overcoming the negative impacts of childhood harm. Let's look at what we will call normal shame. Like other negative emotions, normal shame developed as humans evolved over millions of years. Our capacity to experience normal shame has a survival function. Humans are a communal species, and our survival has always depended on being a member of social groups. Rejection and social isolation are a threat to our very survival. Our capacity to experience normal shame encourages us not to behave in ways which put us at risk of rejection from a group. We can even imagine the shame we might feel in certain situations, and this shapes our behavior. I may have an impulse to have an affair with my assistant, but I imagine the shame I will feel if it all comes to light. I may have an impulse to steal a laptop from work, but I can imagine the shame I will feel if I am caught and get fired. If I feel an impulse to get really drunk, I may recall how ashamed I felt about my behavior the last time I did that. The experience of shame, or even imagining shame, encourages me to engage in behaviors that protect me from rejection by groups. This is normal shame. Like normal shame, trauma based shame involves a sense that I am bad, defective, unworthy, or not okay. However, normal and trauma based shame are very different for two reasons. First, normal shame is simply a product of how our emotions evolved and is designed to help us stay connected to groups. Trauma based shame is a product of abuse, and we will look at how this works in more detail in a moment. Second, normal shame is usually attached to a particular situation, like feeling ashamed because you stole that laptop from work and got fired. Trauma based shame can appear to be attached to situations, but it's fundamentally an emotion an individual carries around with them. Trauma based shame is not really a sense that I was bad or defective with respect to a situation. It's the sense that my whole self is bad or defective. With trauma based shame, it's not really about doing something specifically wrong. It's the sense that my whole self is wrong. Trauma based shame will quite willingly attach itself to a lot of situations. People who experienced childhood abuse can take shame with them everywhere they go, like you might carry around a suitcase. Some can feel a strange impulse to look for evidence in their lives that confirms that they are bad or inadequate. While this experience of badness or inadequacy can express itself through our thoughts, some will say they can feel a sense of shame in their bodies. This is sometimes described as a bodily felt sense of shame. Physically and emotionally abused by his mother, Brandon described this sense of carrying shame around with him. Quote, I always have this feeling like I did something wrong or someone is mad at me. Sometimes I look at people's faces and I wonder, can they see it? It's really not rational. End quote. Let's look at the emotion of guilt. Like normal shame, the emotion of guilt can be helpful. If I've upset or inconvenienced someone, I may feel appropriately guilty, and this can help me understand that I need to make a repair with someone or set something right. Here's what is important to understand. Unlike normal shame or appropriate guilt, trauma based shame is not helpful. Trauma based shame resulting from childhood abuse damages self esteem, induces bad feelings, and undermines personal development. Looked at psychologically and in the context of childhood abuse, trauma based shame is a useless emotion. In fact, it's worse than useless. It's destructive. A body of research connects trauma based shame to a host of problems. When trauma based shame becomes a part of one's sense of self, alcohol and drug abuse is more likely. Trauma based shame is also connected to eating disorders, domestic violence, and physical assaults. Sadly, trauma based shame is more common in people who contemplate suicide or engage in deliberate self harm. So, trauma based shame needs to be seen as something which is getting in the way of your recovery. When we use the word shame during the rest of this chapter, we will be referring to trauma based shame. As we listen to people who experienced childhood trauma, we often hear the voice of shame in their descriptions. It sounds like Barry, a man in his 30s who was emotionally abused and neglected by his parents before being placed into the care system, where things did not improve much. Quote, when I walk into a room, I imagine other people look at me and think, what's wrong with that guy? It doesn't make sense that I should think that, but I do. End quote. It sounds like Marjorie, who experienced childhood sexual abuse. Quote, I have this male friend who is very huggy. He's a really nice guy and he hugs lots of people, but when he hugs me, it just makes me feel dirty. I want to go and take a shower straight away. End quote. Notice how Barry's feelings of defectiveness and Marjorie's feeling of dirtiness seem to be about events. Barry walked into a room of people. Marjorie was hugged by a male friend. But these reactions are not really about the events. Barry and Marjorie's shame laden feelings are deeply connected to a sense of self that was shaped by childhood abuse. Another feature of shame is that shame wants to hide. When people experience shame, they want to disappear, shrink away, or fade into the background. Many people we work with have managed to have relationships and feel a part of a community, but many are disconnected from others and spend a lot of time alone. When shame has become entrenched in an individual's personality, this can help explain the relative isolation or lack of intimacy in the relationships they do have. It's understandable. If shame is felt as a sense of badness or defectiveness, a person may worry that others will see these traits, that they will be found out. If you recognize this shame based impulse to hide from others, please don't despair. Shame is a problem you can work on. Below is a summary of the three ideas we used to describe shame psychologically. 1. Normal shame and appropriate guilt are about a mistake or something you specifically did wrong. Trauma based shame is a consequence of childhood harm. It may attach itself to certain situations, but you carry it with you. It's a sense that your whole self is wrong. 2. Many negative emotions can contain useful information. Trauma based shame, as a consequence of childhood abuse, is fundamentally unhelpful and limits our development. 3. Trauma based shame wants you to hide from others, making it difficult to feel a sense of connection or intimacy. Signs of shame. While shame is a problem for many people who experienced childhood harm, the extent of shame a person carries can vary. How big an issue shame is can relate to the type and severity of abuse and neglect and how robust your biological temperament is. And some individuals have had relationships in adulthood which have helped to heal shame to some extent, which can help. However, others have had further damaging experiences as adults, which only reinforces a sense of shame. As mentioned, shame is a sense of badness, defectiveness, or not being enough. However, on a day to day basis, shame can express itself in various ways, encompassing how you think about yourself and others and how you respond to situations. The questionnaire below presents a list of common shame based experiences or reactions. It may give you a clearer idea of how significant a problem shame is for you. Please pause the audio and complete the shame questionnaire and exercise 1 in the guidebook. How does shame get generated? If someone carries a lot of shame, they very likely were on the receiving end of shaming behaviors. Children are not born with shame. Shame is the product of experiences where children felt humiliation, powerlessness, or worthlessness. In other words, shame is generated by verbal, sexual, or physical abuse and exacerbated by neglect or abandonment. The problem of shame in adults has been strongly connected to childhood sexual abuse and verbal humiliation, as well as physical abuse. If abuse merely produced shame during childhood, that would be bad enough. However, the sense of shame elicited during childhood becomes a part of the individual's self concept, and it tends to endure into adulthood. This is why shame today is less about some current situation and more a feeling about who you are. We mentioned George previously, a man who experienced childhood sexual abuse and substantial bullying at school from peers and teachers. He told us about a deeply ingrained traumatic memory which serves as a striking illustration of how shame gets generated. Quote, I can't remember what I had done, but my teacher told me to come up to the front of the classroom. He had actually made this paddle out of a piece of pallet wood. He beat me in front of the class with a paddle. It was humiliating. End quote. Any form of abuse normally generates shame, and this is certainly true of sexual abuse. Due to the subtle grooming process used in many instances of sexual abuse, shame can seem especially confusing. Martine, mentioned previously, was sexually abused by a stepfather between the ages of 5 and 11. Quote, I didn't know that what was happening was wrong or that it didn't happen to other kids. He paid a lot of attention to me, and it was nice to feel like I had a father like other girls I knew. But when I got older, I began to know how wrong it was, and then I felt disgusting because of what happened. End quote. The experiences of George and Martine illustrate powerfully why children are especially vulnerable to shaming experiences. If abuse occurs to adults who did not experience childhood harm, they may have a robust sense of self which can resist any inclination to feel shame. The adult may think, this is wrong, I shouldn't be treated this way. A healthy sense of self is like a shield that protects us from abusive or shaming experiences. But a robust sense of self takes many years of development and much support from a nurturing carer. Children who lack a safe and supportive attachment are unlikely to develop a robust sense of self, which can resist shaming experiences. The shame just goes right in. Making sense of responsibility for shame. Many people who experience childhood harm struggle with the sense of badness or defectiveness, which are features of shame, but they can also feel responsible for these feelings. Not only do individuals think, I'm bad or inadequate, but they can also think, it's my fault I'm this way. In other words, they imagine they feel a sense of badness because they are bad, rather than seeing that they feel a sense of badness because what happened to them was bad. One explanation for why they are stuck with shame is because they are taking responsibility for the shame they feel, rather than being able to locate responsibility with the people who harmed them. Experiences of shame occurring in the present moment have become disconnected from the original abuse that underlies it. A feature of recovery is to see that shame is connected to the harm which occurred and that you should not have been harmed. There is a compelling metaphor which can help illustrate the role of responsibility as related to shame. Suppose you have an attractive and good quality record player, but the only records you have ever been given are badly scratched and warped. The music is going to sound awful. A child is like the record player. There is nothing wrong with the child. All the shaming messages which result from abuse are like the damaged records. The music is very painful to hear, but it's not the responsibility of the record player, the child. The problem is the horrid records, abusive messages, or shame. But it's practically impossible for children to see the situation as it is. Children don't have the developmental capacity to understand that they are not bad, that the badness is in what is happening to them. Even as adults, people often still believe they are the scratched and warped records. And it can then be difficult to imagine that other records even exist, that there are much better records which can play some really good music. Jerry experienced physical abuse throughout childhood, and he really managed to see shame for what it was. Quote, shame is just a way I got taught to see myself. It's only real when I allow it to be real. End quote. If you struggle with shame, it's essential to see that you did not originally generate feelings of shame. The experience of shame requires social circumstances where you were shamed by others. most likely occurring through abuse. Here's a thought experiment to illustrate this point. Suppose it were possible for you to grow up on a desert island where you had no contact with other human beings. You will certainly experience some distressing emotions like fear and loneliness. But how are you going to experience shame? No one has ever treated you in an abusive manner which induced shame. Have you ever felt especially shameful in the presence of a pet? Unless you have a very strange dog or cat, the answer is normally no. Why is this? Because pets do not treat us with behaviors which are shaming. The point of the desert island scenario and example of our pets isn't to suggest that we should have no relationships or only relationships with our pets. The point is that it's far better to have safe and caring relationships rather than shaming ones. You are responsible for working to heal the shame you carry, but it's important to locate responsibility for shame with those who shamed you. Having the problem of shame is bad enough. Feeling responsible for the problem amounts to adding insult to injury. The shaming experiences you encountered should never have happened. The record player was fine. It still is. You were just given some really bad records. Exercise 2. Connecting shame to an abusive childhood experience. We are going to focus on verbal or emotional abuse as it is the simplest way to do this. Take a few minutes and recall an event from childhood where someone was verbally abusive to you in a way that induced bad feelings about yourself, e.g., feelings of defectiveness or worthlessness. Choose a memory which feels manageable. Imagine yourself as a child during and just after the event, and get a good sense of how you felt about yourself as a child. When you've got a sense of those bad feelings, reflect on this question. Can you still have similar bad feelings about yourself today? If you can see that childhood feelings produced by abuse are the sort of feelings you can still have about yourself today, you are getting a sense of how shame became a part of yourself and how it still endures. Journal any thoughts below which seems relevant concerning this exercise. Please pause the audio and complete exercise 2 in the guidebook. Shame-based anger or aggression. At the outset of this chapter, we mentioned shame is a complicated emotion. Part of the reason for this is the relationship between shame and anger. We will describe this relationship here in a way which we hope will provide clarity for you. As mentioned, trauma-based shame is a sense of badness, inadequacy, or not okayness that a person carries around. In this respect, shame can be seen as anger directed at oneself. I'm bad, worthless, pathetic, a loser. It's not unusual to even hear an individual say things like, I hate myself. So, shame can be seen as self-directed anger. For individuals with more of a submissive style of coping, it's possible that this is where all the shame-based anger gets directed at themselves. However, some people who experienced childhood harm may be more demonstrative characters. The childhood abuse they experienced means they struggle with shame as well, but they may cope differently. If they imagine they might be criticized or humiliated in a way which would trigger shame, they defend themselves through outward expressions of anger or aggression. This is why simplistic anger management training often doesn't work for people who experienced childhood harm. Such training rarely addresses the underlying trauma and associated shame. John is a good example of how anger can be directed outward to defend against feelings of shame. We mentioned John previously, a man who had been emotionally and physically abused by an alcoholic father. On countless occasions, he had been humiliated by his father, and as a result, he carried a lot of shame, a sense of defectiveness and insecurity. John had planned to cook dinner for his family. He told us, quote, Janet, his wife, asked when we were having dinner. I said, I don't know. And then I'm getting angry at her about all the work I have to do to keep the house from falling down, and I'm shouting, and she's really upset. And the kids can hear. I go upstairs and stand in the hallway, and I'm shaking and thinking, what am I doing? End quote. When we explored John's anger, things made more sense. John explained that he was going to make a chicken based dinner, but he needed paprika and barbecue sauce, and he'd realized it was Sunday and the stores were now closed. He hadn't explained his oversight to Janet, and he was afraid she'd be disappointed or annoyed, and maybe the kids would be as well. Anger or aggression was a way that John sometimes defended against any criticism which might elicit the shame he had carried since childhood. As mentioned in the chapter entitled Emotions, anger is an important emotion which can be useful as a self protective response when you have been mistreated. But shame based anger, when directed inwardly or outwardly, can be confusing and unhelpful. Shame based anger is like a coin with two sides. The coin itself represents childhood harm and associated shame. Just like a coin has two sides, the angry expression of shame can be directed at the self or the world. But wherever it's directed, it comes from the same place. It comes from the historical harm you experienced. There are three ways to identify when anger is based in shame and past abuse. 1. The anger feels out of proportion to events. 2. The anger seems to be about more than the current situation. And 3. The anger doesn't seem helpful. In the final section, we look at some ideas for beginning to heal shame. However, healing shame can also be thought of as healing shame-based anger. Exercise 3. Your thoughts on shame-based anger. Can you identify with shame-based anger? In other words, can you feel anger which is out of proportion to events, seems to be about more than the current situation, and doesn't seem helpful? Please pause the audio and complete exercise 3 in the guidebook. Healing shame. It's definitely possible to make progress at healing shame, but it's also important to be realistic. As mentioned, shame is less an emotion connected to particular events and more like a part of an individual's identity. So, shame can have some fairly deep roots. You can think of shame as the terminator of trauma based feelings. You can deal with it some days or in certain situations, but it'll be back. This should not be a cause for cynicism, but it's useful when dealing with shame to take the long view. Because shame is a part of your self concept, you'll probably have to respond to it many times. But every time you do, shame may lose a little bit of its hold on you. 1. Shame busting in 3 steps. In the same way people can take their phone, wallet, or purse with them, many individuals take shame with them every day. This sense of shame likes to pop up and attach itself to many experiences. It's possible to deal with an experience of shame in 3 steps. Detect shame, challenge shame, or reassure yourself, and let shame go. Step 1 of healing shame is developing your shame detector. This just means spotting shame when you are experiencing it. Whenever you suddenly feel some sense of inadequacy, defectiveness, unworthiness, etc., see it for what it is and call it out. Aha, this is shame I'm feeling. I'm feeling this because people harmed me in the past. Keep in mind that you might experience shame directly, or shame might be hiding behind anger you are feeling towards others. You can personalize and use your shame detector in whatever way works best for you. Adele experienced childhood sexual abuse, and we like how she went about it. Quote, I never thought of what I experienced as shame. I just thought that I was a useless waste of space. But now, when it happens, I just say, shut up, stupid shame. I have to say that a lot. End quote. Adele did have to say that a lot, and that's one of the challenges of developing and remembering to use your shame detector. Shame is not going to go willingly. Shame is like a bad tenant who makes a lot of noise, breaks things, doesn't pay their rent, and doesn't want to leave. To have any chance of getting rid of it, you have to see it happening in your daily life again and again and again. Shame is subtle and crafty, and there is a common problem that can throw off your shame detector. Once you detect that you are feeling shame, it can seem very natural to rationalize it. In other words, you may find reasons why you're supposed to feel inadequate or defective. You may think, I'm supposed to feel bad about me because fill in the blank with your favorite way of rationalizing shame. Ryan's words below represent a good example of how many individuals rationalize shame. Ryan was physically and emotionally abused by both parents and had isolated himself for much of his adult life. Following some months of therapy, he joined a poker group he had been avoiding for years. Quote, I didn't have much to say, so I just played poker. Everyone else was laughing and telling stories. They were all having a lot of fun. I felt so useless. End quote. Can you see how Ryan rationalized the need to feel shame? He decided he was useless because he said less than the others. Unless you think undermining your confidence and impeding your personal development is a good idea, there really is no good rationale for trauma based shame. Shame is not your friend. A healthy shame detector will also be able to distinguish shame from guilt. Recall that if you feel bad because you have genuinely upset or inconvenienced someone, that's guilt. You can often make some repair to deal with your feelings of guilt. Like guilt, shame involves having bad feelings about yourself, but in the absence of having inconvenienced, upset, or hurt anyone. With shame, you didn't do anything wrong. You just feel you are wrong. Unless you think feeling defective or worthless is important, trauma based shame is pointless. Once you have detected shame, aha, this is shame I'm feeling, you can then challenge shame or reassure yourself. This is step 2, and let it go. This is step 3. How you stand up to shame depends on the circumstances and the particular expression of shame. Julie, an individual who experienced childhood neglect and multiple forms of abuse, was 10 minutes late for her GP appointment. Quote, the receptionist told me to have a seat. When I was waiting, I felt so awful. I was so angry with myself, and I felt sure my GP was upset with me. How could I have made such a mess of things? End quote. You can get a sense of the badness or defectiveness Julie was feeling and how it's less about the situation and more about the sense of shame she brought to the situation. However, once Julie detected that she was experiencing shame. She told herself, quote, I'm just 10 minutes late to an appointment. I haven't done anything terrible, and I was late because there was traffic works I didn't know about. My GP is a kind person, and she knows that I'm always on time, so I'm sure she'll understand. This was challenging shame or reassuring herself. She continued, quote, now, stop beating yourself up about it and check your emails, end quote. This was letting go of shame. And that is standing up to shame or reassuring yourself and letting it go. But it's also Julie's way of dealing with that particular shame reaction, which occurred in that particular situation. Responding to shame will involve some creative thinking on your part. Some individuals have found it useful to write shame challenging statements down on a card and then carry the card in a purse or wallet. If the idea of carrying statements seems silly, consider this. If you're going to carry shame with you, why not carry some statements which can be used to stand up to shame? Why not level the playing field? 2. Avoid shame-inducing relationships. Seek relationships which help heal shame. If you were shamed by people when you were a child, you may be vulnerable to getting into relationships with people who continue to induce or reinforce the feeling of shame. Recall the chapter on re-traumatization and relationship patterns. You might not even recognize that you are in a relationship with someone who is reinforcing shame because this type of relationship may seem normal or what you deserve. And if shaming relationships are familiar to you, you might feel uncomfortable or mistrustful in relationships which could help heal shame. There is a fairly straightforward way to know whether you have a relationship with someone who reinforces the feeling of shame or who helps to heal shame. You just need to consider some questions. How do you feel while with them and just after seeing them? Do you feel better about yourself and life? Or do you feel worse about yourself and life? Do you feel safe with them? This question works for all relationships, whether a friend, partner, colleague, or family member. The information in Chart 1 can help you consider whether your current relationships reinforce or heal shame in more detail. Please pause the audio and review Chart 1 in the guidebook. Exercise 4. Considering your relationships in respect to shame. Reflect on the people you are spending the most time with and consider whether these people reinforce or help to heal shame. When thinking about these relationships, consider the main question we mentioned. When you spend time with them, how do you feel while with them and just after seeing them? Do you feel better about yourself in life, or do you feel worse about yourself in life? You can also refer to Chart 1 to consider these relationships and use the space below for any journaling. Please pause the audio and complete Exercise 4 in the guidebook. 3. Reducing shame-reinforcing behaviors. We mentioned that shame often expresses itself as a self-perception of inadequacy, badness, or lacking worth. People who experience childhood harm seem especially vulnerable to behaving in ways that reinforce these self-perceptions. In other words, an individual's behavior can help shame to stay stuck. The fact that this can happen needs to be seen with self-compassion and insight. After all, the emotional difficulties such individuals experience seem to require more extreme coping. Shame is part of an individual's sense of self, and anything deeply rooted in our self concept wants us to keep going in the same direction. We mentioned Jerry previously, a man who was physically and emotionally abused by his father, and you can see the way shame gets stuck for him. Quote, after work, I often tell myself to stop at 2 or 3 pints, but then I just don't. When I look at my face in the morning, I look like crap and I feel like crap. I hate that I keep doing this. End quote. Marjorie's relationship to deliberate self harm is also a good illustration of how shame can stay stuck. Quote, it's not like I want to self harm, but there are times when I just feel so awful and stressed that it can seem like I have to do it to just get some relief. But after I've self harmed, I hate myself for having to rely on it. It makes me feel weak and pathetic. End quote. Substance abuse or deliberate self harm are just two examples. It may work differently for you, but we are talking about any behavior you feel compelled to do that leaves you feeling worse or more shameful. Compulsive eating, spending, gambling, or sexuality can all represent shame reinforcing behaviors. We will mention one final example because it not only illustrates a shame reinforcing behavior, but it's just one of those discussions you never forget. Karen was emotionally abused throughout childhood. During one group session, she said, quote, I fall down the stairs a lot, like maybe once or twice a month. I just trip and go down the stairs. End quote. Another member said, quote, that's awful. Do you get hurt? End quote. Sure, said Karen. Sometimes. It depends on how far I fall. Karen, said a therapist, do you know why you keep falling down the stairs? Have you seen a doctor? Karen smiled. Oh, no, there's nothing medically wrong with me. I wear slippers, and I just don't seem to pay attention to where I'm going. This was a humorous moment in the session, but something serious was also going on. During further exploration, it was clear that Karen's lack of attention and self care was not only causing her real harm, but reinforcing shameful feelings about herself. Exercise 5. Shame reinforcing behaviors. Can you identify any behaviors which serve to keep shame stuck? Are there ways you may wish to drop or reduce such behaviors? Please pause the audio and complete exercise 5 in the guidebook. This then completes the audio for the chapter on healing shame.